Good morning, afternoon, and evening to those of you joining us from around the world. Before we begin, I would just like to confirm that this event has simultaneous interpretation into French. For those of you that would require interpretation, please use the following toll-free number, 1-833-493-2020 to receive French audio. The attendee access code is 95229477. My colleague will include these numbers in the chat.
Before we begin, I just want to confirm that we have simultaneous interpretation into French. For those of you who need interpretation, please call the following number, 1-833-493-2020 to get the French audio. The access code for participants is 95229477. My colleague will cut and paste these numbers in the chat.
Meyerhofer. I'm the Canadian Ombudsperson for Responsible Enterprise, and it is my pleasure to moderate this discussion today. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I am joining today's event from Ottawa, which is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. I would also like to thank the OECD for the opportunity to facilitate this important discussion. Today's event will focus on key issues related to child rights and child labor in the garment sector. A few logistics before we move on. Please note that we are recording this webinar, and both English and French recordings will be available on our website along with a summary report. Our panel look forward to answering your questions during the final 15 minutes of our session today. Please use the Q&A function on the bottom right-hand side of your screen to send your questions in either English or French. If you are experiencing technical difficulties, please email our technician who is on standby. His email is being included in the chat. And now let's begin. Our discussion today is on garment companies and suppliers and how they can put in place strong due diligence requirements to identify and prevent the use of child labor. Above all, this is an opportunity to share important lessons and best practices. This conversation is taking place as consumers increasingly demand greater transparency and accountability from garment companies and the fashion industry as a whole. We are also seeing a movement nationally and internationally towards due diligence legislation. Within this broader context, we hope to learn today how COVID-19 pandemic has affected garment supply chains and human rights due diligence activities on the ground. Our discussion builds on the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, as well as the due diligence that the OECD has produced for responsible supply chains in the garment and footwear sector. Just one final note before we turn to our panel. My office was established by the Canadian government to promote responsible business conduct in Canada's garment, mining, and oil and gas sectors. Within that mandate, we recently launched a study that will examine the possible use of child labor in Canada's garment sector. We look forward to sharing the findings of our study with you later this year. I'd now like to introduce our four panelists. Collectively, they bring a wealth of experience and a range of perspectives. Our first panelist is Tulika Bansel. Tulika is a senior advisor on business and human rights with the Danish Institute for Human Rights. For more than a decade, she has engaged with corporate actors, governments, UN agencies, and national human rights institutions to promote respect for human rights and in the private sector. Our second panelist is Ines Kamfer. Ines is the CEO of the Center for Child Rights in Business, a social enterprise that works with companies, including garment companies, to protect and promote child rights in supply chains. Under Ines's leadership, the center has become a leading global expert on child prevention and remediation that now covers 16 countries. Our third panelist is Claire O'Kane. Claire is an international child rights consultant. She is a practitioner and researcher with more than 25 years of international experience in child rights and participation work in diverse contexts. Our fourth panelist is Claudia Sandoval. Claudia is Vice President for Corporate Citizenship with Gildan, one of Canada's largest garment companies. She manages Gildan's environmental, social, and governance program across the global supply chain. Thank you all for joining us today. So let's begin the discussion. Ines, can you start off the discussion by providing us with your thoughts on the main risks related to child labor facing the garment sector in 2022?
Thank you so much, Sherry. And first of all, thanks for having me. Really happy to be here. I think to understand kind of what's coming towards the garment sector in 2022, it might be important to look at a couple of trends, and I only mentioned three, so I won't talk for an hour. But I think one important one is obviously that throughout the NGO and child rights kind of organizations, everyone agrees and has observed, or at least assumes, that there is an increase in child labor in the last 2 years. Because one of the probably most devastating side effects of COVID is that many children, have had significant hurdles to access education, and access to schooling is very closely related to the risk to child labor. So the harder the access, the greater the risk. So that's one thing to keep in mind, in particular because that access to schooling has had a lot of the lack of access to schooling had a lot of impact in typical sourcing countries of the garment industry, such as Bangladesh, for example, who have seen hardly a day of school in 2021. And for many of those kids, that means they've lost the access to schooling entirely. So they've just given up on school and are now moving on to something else, which often is entering the labor market way too early. On the business side, we've observed a increased lack of transparency. The Hong Kong consultancy Elevate has, through the data, thousands of audits that they have available, seen that in 2021, transparency within supply chain has decreased by over 30%. That means we do know less what's really going on in the supply chain. And that decrease was particularly significant in Asia, where it was already kind of rather intransparent, or that was the most intransparent area to start with. So we have a big kind of issue that we don't know what's going on in our supply chain, and a kind of contradictory or kind of on collision course to that trend. It's the third trend I wanted to mention, and that is the increased pressure that the sector is dealing with. The pressure comes from governments through strengthened legal frameworks, but it also comes from banks and investors who put more and more importance to environmental and social governance. A recent study by PwC has shown that nearly half of banks are ready to divest if they see a lack of actions on ESG amongst their investees. And they've also, about 1/3 say they've already have refused investments if they saw this lack of action. So clear, strong pressure coming from there, and pressure coming from the business itself or throughout the chain. So this kind of government financial institution pressure trickles down through businesses, who now put much more pressure also on their business partners. And so it doesn't just impact the big businesses, it impacts the smaller one as well. And all of that will create a lot of pressure for the garment sector to try to counter that lack of transparency and dig deeper. But knowing that we have such a big risk of child labor in many of those areas, my prediction is that once companies do that, and go in particular once they go deeper down the supply chain, they unfortunately will find more evidence and more risk of child labor in these next coming months. So that's just very short, a couple of trends, and I hope I get time to elaborate a bit more on some of those.
Great, thank you, Ines. I'm going to move now to Tulika and just ask, what's your take on this? Based on your experience working for the Denmark's National Human Rights Institution, what do you see as the main risks related to child rights in the garment sector this year?
Thank you for the question, Sherry. I wanted to share 3 points as well. The first being that in addition to the pandemic, I want to point out the example of Myanmar. Myanmar, a couple of years ago, opened up for business, and a lot of garment companies entered Myanmar. But as most of you might be aware of, a year ago, the country was taken over by the military, and that has hugely affected the garment sector. And with all consequences, in addition to the pandemic, and which is affecting workers and also children and families due to orders that have been cancelled and or companies that have temporarily stopped production in Myanmar. And this has led to no income for families and affecting livelihoods of families, including children. The second thing that I wanted to mention, what Ines alluded to, is access to education, which has hugely affected children not being able to attend school and then entering the workforce. Another issue to consider is that of working women in the garment sector. Many women are those that work in the sector, but have also been differently and adversely affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. And as women are often the primary caretakers of children, this has also directly affected children, from sickness of mothers to deaths. And this has also led to children having to work instead of their mothers. And then the last point that I wanted to raise is also adding on to what Ines said around transparency. Due to the pandemic, there have been less opportunities for companies in the garment industry to conduct social audits or other types of assessments or studies on the ground to assess and address children's rights issues, including child labor. Many of such audits were transformed into virtual audits, so audits through video connections and phone calls. But for an issue like child labor, which is already more of a hidden practice, it is already challenging to detect this issue through an in-person audit. So it is practically impossible to identify child labor through a video connection. How do you build trust with your interviewee? And how can you, for example, do age verification through a video interview? How can you speak to workers and families offsite in a trustworthy environment and understand the drivers behind child labor? So these are some of the risks that we are seeing this year.
Great, thanks, Julika. We're building quite a list here. So now I want to jump to Claudia. As a representative of one of Canada's largest garment brands, what does Gildan see as some of the main child-related risks for the sector from your perspective?
Thank you, Sherry, and I'm very honored to be here and sharing our experience in this area. For those of you who might not be very familiar with Gildan, Gildan is a vertically integrated manufacturer. We own and operate large-scale vertically integrated factories in North America, Central America, the Caribbean, and Bangladesh. We have been operating under a strong commitment of leading practices in labor governance and environmental standards. This topic around challenges related to child labor, it's something that we have been looking at for many years, and obviously we have identified challenges that are impacting the industry or the sector. One of them, and it has been mentioned by our panelists, it's related to the complex and fragmented supply chain of the garment industry. And I think we all agree that it has been good work for companies looking at tier one factories or factories manufacturing the finished goods, but we need to look at what's happening in the other areas of spinning or growing the raw material for the products. And this is connected with the sector. It's sourcing dependent. It's a sourcing dependent industry. And as I mentioned before, as we go upstream, there is less visibility on what's happening in tier 2 or tier 3 factories. In our case, we feel that our commitment to traceability must go beyond tier 1, and it's our responsibility to ensure that tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers are meeting our standards in our traceability strategies. The other challenge that I would like to mention is connected to the efforts, and we still see isolated efforts from government, civil society, and international organizations, and those efforts, since are isolated, might not be, or they lack momentum for a significant impact. And again, as some of the panelists were mentioning, there are different socioeconomic factors that we need to take into account in the different countries where garment companies are operating. Again, in the case of Gildan, owning the factories and operating tier 2, tier 3 factories, we think it has been a good experience for us to have better visibility and have better control of the supply chain.
Great, thank you very much, Claudia. So Claire, taking to you, what about in your work, which is very specific, how do you see the ongoing pandemic affecting children who work? What do children say about the risks they face and what is needed to address them?
Yeah, thank you. Well, particularly I'm focusing on some findings over the past 6 years where I've been working with working children who are organised in their own children's committees through It's Time to Talk and Dialogue Works projects supported by Kindernothilfe and Tedesam and a number of NGOs across 15 countries, and kind of linked to this some studies, particularly with working children and caregivers, about the impact of COVID on their lives. And as already emphasised by other panelists, the children and young people have really emphasised the kind of real negative impact on education, and particularly the digital divide that really makes children kind of affected by poverty even worse affected by those that have been able to continue education through online. Both caregivers have talked, particularly in the early stages of the pandemic and the lockdown, how it really led to loss of work and loss of income due to the market closures and the kind of lack of public transport. But as the kind of mobility started, then again there was less work. It was much harder for children and caregivers to do what they were doing prior to the pandemic. So that's really increased risks of children engaging in worse forms of work and being more exploited, being paid less for doing much longer work. And children have also spoken up about the kind of increased violence they faced within the families, within communities, within workplaces where they have been able to get back to work. And they've also been very clear on kind of their own recommendations. So including the need for governments, for donors, for NGOs to really consult and collaborate with them and with both children and caregivers to better understand their realities and to support them. And the real strong focus on the need to support their survival, access to food security, to cash, to various, they didn't know the word social protection, but what they were asking for was basically kind of access to social protection schemes and the access to quality education. So again, like either supporting children to safely go back to school, or if the education was continue online, to ensure that they had access to phones or computer network allowed that, and the broader access to health services. They had a lot of fears about even going to a health centre because of the risk of getting COVID. So there was kind of a lack of health services generally, and again the need for access to accessible kind of non-discriminatory protection services at every level. I'll stop there, but there's a lot more that I've got to say.
Great. Well, hopefully we can circle back through some other questions, and we'll give you a chance at the end to add some thoughts also. So I just want to shift a little bit right now based on the risk you've identified and start a discussion sort of addressed at solutions, finding out more about how companies are addressing child labor, and again, identifying the ongoing barriers that we see. So I want to start first with industry this time. And Claudia, what strategies has Gildan put in place to prevent and address child labor? I think you're on mute, Claudia.
Thanks, Sherry. And this is an excellent question, and I would like to address it from two angles. One of them is due diligence processes, and the other element will be employee involvement. And let me talk to due diligence processes. I think we are familiar with the traditional way in which companies have been monitoring or trying to prevent child labor or protecting children's rights. And it has been through the traditional audit and monitoring systems. We do think that this process has to evolve, and we are looking at due diligence from different angles. From a different angle now, and it should include obviously human rights risk assessments to identify what it's happening in different countries. The realities are different and vary depending on the location. And once we identify those risks, to ensure that there is an ongoing monitoring system in place, it's key. And to provide clear and concise guidelines to factories and suppliers. And for us, that has been a very important to detect that capacity building with factories. It's an ongoing process, and it has given good results. The other part of due diligence, it has to do, and it's something that we have been implementing in the past few years. It's looking at responsible purchasing and planning practices. And I'm speaking here about planning practices because we own the factories, and the vast majority of our products are produced in factories that we own. So looking at responsible planning, it's important. And so we have developed policies around this area of responsible planning and production. But the key for us is also to provide training to the members of the management who are involved, because at the end they are the ones in the day-to-day dealing with factories. And if they have the knowledge of how the decisions on production might impact human rights, might impact the life of children, they will be in a better position to detect or raise the flag. So the other element in transparency and traceability, we think that's very key. And in the past few years, as we all know, there has been a lot of effort from companies to communicate lists of factories. In our case, what we have in our website, it's really that all factories in tier 2, tier 3, because it's 90% manufacturing in our facility. So most of our manufacturers are there on that list. So within traceability, it's key. The presence of grievance mechanisms as well, and those grievance mechanisms must be available for not only the factory, but also for the stakeholders in the communities. And it's something we have done as well, extending our channels to community members. And finally, on due diligence, we think it's very important to communicate with local and international stakeholders, and they play a key role. They know what it's happening in the communities, and we have been trying to to implement or add that element to our due diligence processes. Now, finally, I would like to go to this element within it's very key and very important to protecting children's rights, and it's about employee involvement through the strengthening of local educational systems in countries where we operate. And it's how we have get to that conclusion, and it's basically consulting with workers, consulting with employees. 50% of our employees are women, and they face that challenge with their children. And when we go and ask, they mention that we should get involved and work with the schools in the communities where they have their children. So it has been a good experience working in that area. Just in 2020, more than 300 schools were supported. We faced the challenge of COVID, and then suddenly not having access to technology. So we partnered with an international NGO to support teachers to use the technology and to have better access to communicate with children. So they're having different mechanisms that we have used to support education. Finally, we did a pilot with the Center for Child Rights that Ines is managing, and it was a very great experience to connect children and their parents that are coming from rural areas, and they don't see their children, but bring their children to where the parents are have their work and have this a special time during the summer. It has been a very good a very good program that we think is worth it to continue expanding. So summarizing two elements then in terms of solution, strengthening due diligence processes, and second, strengthening educational programs in the communities where we have our factories.
Great, excellent. Thank you very much, Claudia. Now, I just want to say, as we've heard from Claudia, Gildan is a large integrated company. So in this, I want to sort of look at a different kind of company. And based on your work with the different garment companies, how are small and medium-sized enterprises coping with these issues?
Well, there are many SMEs, so obviously they cope with that differently. But I would say there is probably two tendencies. I mean, there is the tendencies of what we hear sometimes when we talk to smaller companies or medium-sized companies, that they say, "Oh, we're too small. We have no leverage. Our buying power is very small. We are only, I don't know, 5% of the factory, etc." But I think there is this other tendency that we can see. For one, this has to do with the pressure that I just mentioned at the beginning of the larger companies becoming more and more demanding towards all their business partners. So, for example, online websites where you sell your things, online retailers will become demanding on towards the people that they feature on their websites and say, look, we need to have those places or we need to have those systems in place. So a smaller company will feel that pressure. So even a smaller brand, same thing with, so last year alone, we have worked with 21, I would say, tentatively bigger companies who have rewritten their child labor policies and guidelines. And in those guidelines, they've mainly, or one of the big parts was to increase their expectations towards their business partners. So that's the importers, for the retailers, that is all kind of the brands, etc., that they feature. And so this really affects then the small and medium companies. So those expectations towards human rights due diligence, towards child rights due diligence are hitting the smaller companies. And in my experience, to be very practical, I think actually smaller SMEs can make their size to their advantage. While big retailers will have to deal with thousands of potential manufacturers and suppliers. the smaller ones might deal with a small handful of numbers that they're sourcing from. And that really is actually to their advantage because they can focus. And we're working with one of our partners that is, they're part of our working group, which is kind of one good way of smaller companies to become part of multi-stakeholder kind of initiative and bring in their voice there and find others to kind of tackle those challenges together. Secondly, they've put aside a small budget. Their kind of ESG department is one person, but it put aside, I think it's $10,000 a year. They have probably around 6 key manufacturers in the world that they're working with, and every year they single out one and invest those $10,000 to strengthen their capacity to work with them. They, for example, have set up long-lasting programs in those suppliers to support migrant parents workers. They have set up long-lasting programs to support after-school centers for children. So they just found their very practical areas where they could make those changes, even if their budgets are not in the hundreds and thousands of dollars. And so we really see that, I think, both from what they have to do in order to be able to make business and be part of this bigger industry, but also what is possible, that there is a lot of possibilities with SMEs. And the laws, the big supply chain laws that target mainly the bigger companies, they will still have an impact on those SMEs. And I think therefore many feel also the necessity to step up and strengthen their systems.
Great. And just a sort of a follow-up question, Ines, is be interested in hearing from you about your center's work with companies to conduct child rights impact assessments.
Yes, I've already hinted to a couple of things that we're doing with companies, but there's a lot of things we're doing and different things with companies depending on where they are in their journey and what their needs are. But one of the things is supporting companies to better understand their supply chain, to create some of that transparency that has been so difficult to achieve lately. So we do a lot of child rights risk assessments where we're drilling down depending on risk areas. Sometimes we start bigger, sometimes we drill down from the beginning to really understand where are your risks, what is the situation in your supply chain, and then create a set of follow-ups and very practical measures. Those practical measures go from kind of preventative measures on awareness building, making sure we have the systems in factories, in particular to prevent child labor, but also preventing some of the root causes. As I mentioned, one thing to call out, for example, that we work with factories to set up after-school centers that then are factory run. So we don't run them, the factories run them, and that allows children to stay in school longer. And for example, for many children during COVID, these after-school centers have become very important because they were not the after-school centers, they were just the only centers that the children had available. But it helps to keep children from dropping out of school and coming into child labor situations. And then the third, I would say, big area of work is that we do work strongly on remediation with the factories, which I think is probably something that is often hard to find. Sorry, not with the factories, with the companies. So if any company finds child labor issues anywhere in their supply chain, no matter the level, we are there to work with the companies to set a remediation process that can be collective or individual in place that allows the companies to really tackle and react to that and ensure that maybe some of the damage that has been done, but that is, in my view, also not totally preventable. So my perspective is, to be honest, that every company who will look very, very closely will find child labor issues in their supply chains. And I think what distinguishes the more responsible companies from the others is that the more responsible ones will know about that and have a system to follow up about on this. And so we have a system, a kind of a global child labor remediation system in place, and companies basically call us. And I think we have a big case coming, or it seems to be a big challenge coming up in Bangladesh. So we just put together, I think, 10 of our case managers and assessors who will go out to a set of factories tomorrow in Bangladesh where child labor has been identified. And so that is kind of part of the very practical remediation work that we're doing.
Great. Thank you so much, Ines. Tulika, over to you. How can companies take a holistic approach to tackling child labor and avoid merely a focus on compliance risk management?
Thank you, Sherry. a few things were already mentioned by Ines, but what I've seen in the past is that child labor is very often seen very much from a compliance perspective, an issue that needs to be addressed as soon as possible and to be able to tick the box that there is no child labor present anymore, because that is really seen as one of the gravest issues that can be found. And it's really an issue that you don't want to fail at as part of a social audit. However, companies should realize that when there is child labor, this often has many causes that should be addressed at the root and requires for the company not only looking at the finding of child labor alone, but why it exists, and putting in place a proper system to address this, a program that takes time. So companies should be looking at different issues, for example, access to education, family-friendly policies, the price that they pay to their workers for piecework, or the wages that they pay more generally. It requires engagement with different stakeholders across the value chain, both internally in the company, but also externally, including with child rights experts and child labor organizations. So it's not just something that you can tackle as a compliance issue that you can tick off the box. So to summarize, it's not an issue that you can just comply with by law, but you need much more in place to address the issue of child labor.
Right, and I just want to sort of do a follow-up. You talked about child rights and a focus on child rights. So I'm wondering why child labor needs to be framed within a broader child rights and human rights framework. Why is that important?
Well, first of all, children's rights are part of the broader human rights framework. And we should realize that children are differently impacted than adults due to their physique, and therefore their rights should be taken into consideration differently than adults. So therefore, it's really important that when companies look at their human rights impacts, they should specifically consider, assess and address children's rights issues and drawing in child rights expertise. However, child labor and other children's rights impacts are often the result of a bigger picture, a larger human rights picture, so cannot be seen completely separately. So earlier on, I mentioned, for example, the payment of wages. If a company doesn't pay a living wage, then there is a chance that they'll involve their children at work. Or if you have people that work from home and you have a piece rate, then there is a chance that they involve their children. If there is no creche for children at a factory, then maybe they'll bring their children to work. If there is no school, then there is a bigger chance that children are involved. So you have to look at the bigger picture, both from the company perspective, but also the government perspective, because they are, for example, the ones that have to provide adequate schooling or schools that are accessible or not too expensive. And if all of this doesn't exist, this can lead to children's rights impacts that affect garment workers. And one other point that I wanted to mention is why we have to look at children's rights and child labor in the bigger human rights context is the issue that you mentioned, Sherry, when we opened, is the developments that we're seeing at the moment regarding mandatory human rights due diligence legislation. For the garment sector specifically, this is important, being a sector with a long, complex supply chain that exists across different countries and regions, meaning that companies that are domiciled in the EU or other countries that already have or soon will have such legislation will be obliged to practice human rights due diligence. So to identify and address human rights issues they find, and these will include children's rights issues, and companies will have to be prepared for this development, as the responsibility to respect human rights and children's rights is soon going to become mandatory rather than being voluntary.
Great, thanks, Julia. It was helpful for you to zoom it out just so we could see how child rights or child labor fits within child rights and human rights. I want to now sort of focus in a little bit on how do children who work do their role with in their lives. So, Claire, Do children see positives? If so, what practices and policies can garment companies implement to enhance these positive aspects of child work? What's the perspective of children who work?
Yeah, I mean, the perspectives are super diverse. In the It's Time to Talk research, we had kind of focus group discussions and activities with over 1,800 working children across 36 countries. Some of these children were involved in the textile, carpet and weaving industry, but a lot were engaged in a wide range of the types of work within agriculture, small-scale bending, a kind of real variety. And the kind of motivations and reasons and their views on what they like and what they don't like, they were just numerous, and again, depending on what they were doing. In terms of, again, the motivations, while some felt really forced and compelled to work due to poverty or family hardship, a number of children really were actively involved in that decision, in the decision to work, and wanted to help families to earn money towards the basic needs. And a number of the children were actually earning money to continue their education. So there's a much more nuanced and complex relationship between school education and work that I think really needs to be better understood. They were clear that they didn't want to do work that was too harmful, violence, that was exploitative, or that disrupted their education. But they also had very, really expressed a lot of things they did like about their work. They felt, and a really significant proportion really emphasised that they feel proud to help families. That they wanted to earn money to support, particularly when families were in hardship conditions. But again, in a lot of settings, not just to earn money, but to just seeing themselves as a member of the household, so they should be helping out. A number also shared how they gained skills through their work, and again, they particularly liked it when money earnings helped them continue education. But again, they were very clear on the types of work. And it wasn't just about the type of work, but again, the working conditions. So they really wanted the work to ensure they liked it when there was respectful communication, whether it was with an employer or with their parent, was, they're working for their parent, when work was light enough so they had enough time to study, to rest, to play, when they learned skills through their work, so they really didn't want to do work that was like just repetitive and no skills. And particularly they liked it when the work was aligned with what they wanted to become in the future, and so they saw it as a kind of helping them meet their kind of aspirations. And when they were paid decently or had other benefits, if there was health support or if there was food provided in the workplace, for example, and when there's no violence. I mean, interesting, again, there's a lot of gender dimensions. So girls, particularly in a number of the settings, said they preferred work they could do from home rather than having to work on the street, where they faced a lot more exposure to sexual harassment and abuse outside the home. And children also really emphasised that they're able to have better working conditions when they're heard, when they really adults ask them what work they do or don't want to do, how much hours they do or don't want to do. So children who organised in their child clubs, who work in children's associations or movements, they felt more able to really defend their rights and to have access to good work and prevent exploitation. I mean, it's really, I think, garment companies need to understand the actual local context, the social, cultural, political, the economic context, particularly what we've just talked about with the impact of COVID. That needs to be really understood in order to prevent exploitation and harmful work, especially knowing the survival pressure and if there's lack of access to education or violence or discriminatory school, that's really going to impact on what children's options are and what families' options are. Like emphasised by other panelists, we really need family-friendly policies and practices, and the existing policies and practice needs to be much better implemented and monitored. And looking at unexpected impacts as what's planned, because sometimes it might be done for a good intention, but actually it might have even worse impact on children and families. And again, as emphasised by other panelists, to really ensure decent working conditions for every worker, so that caregivers, mothers, fathers, uncles, grandparents, whoever's working, have access to really decent pay that allows them to afford access to basic services and education and healthcare for their own children. And I think, again, then making sure that young workers really have access to unions, to information about their rights, to complaint mechanisms within the workplace, and that the codes of conduct really, again, respect every worker and allow young workers as well as older workers to really have a say about what's going on within the workplace. And I think, again, within the garment industry, this includes these kind of codes of conduct and monitoring to be done, not just in factories, but seeing if there is work, if work is outsourced to home-based work, it needs to include reaching young people in those contexts to really better understand what's going on and respond to their views.
Great, thanks, Claire. I think you've given us a lot of ideas about lessons learned in your work in facilitating child participation. I'm just wondering if you have anything more you'd like to say in this area of best practice that is growing in how you would engage, how you're engaging them, how do you get them to participate? That might be something. Do you have anything further to say on that? You mentioned it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a long history of there's a long history of children organising themselves and being part of their own associations and movements, particularly in Latin America, in Africa, and Asia. So for over 30 years experience there of working children themselves, of civil society organisations collaborating and accompanying those children. So I think it's important for government companies, for business sector to really better partner with those organisations who've got kind of access to really listen and support children to better defend their rights, to hear what they want in terms of the kind of family-centred policies. To meet and regularly, I mean, children just repeatedly ask, they want to enter into dialogue with, whether it's the government officials, the business leaders, whoever's there who's meant to be protecting their rights. And their rights include the right to be heard. And very few duty bearers really create this space for children to be heard and to really consider their views and to take decisions based in their best interests. I think these issues can be quite complex. So to really address issues that local seeing children in context, listening to them and their caregivers in context, and getting so the actual consultation methods, we've learned a lot of just about the benefits of using really visual arts, creative kind of methods, but also the real importance of supporting children to really come together in their own groups, because they build trust with one another, they give a lot of solidarity to one another, and in that regular meeting is where they have the increasing confidence, but also more power from the information they can access from their own analysis to organise their own kind of action and advocacy initiatives. And I guess, again, linked to it is the need to work with caregivers, because sometimes children, again, making sure they have enough say within the family. So how can you also kind of support the kind of positive parenting side of it to really take their children serious, give them kind of opportunities to really be heard.
Great. Fascinating. Thank you, Claire. So I just want to thank all the panelists for your illuminating perspectives on risks, barriers, and solutions. There's been a lot that's been put out there. I'd just like to now ask each of you to provide a couple minutes of concluding points, or you can feel free to emphasize or respond to anything that came up as you listened to the perspectives of your colleagues. And I will just give you each 3 minutes. And I'm going to suggest we go alphabetically by last name. So that's Tulika, Ines, Claire, and Claudia. So Tulika, take us away.
Thanks, Sherry, and thanks to all my co-panelists. It's been a pleasure to speak about this important topic and listen to your experiences. I think my key message from this whole session is that the importance of taking a holistic approach by not seeing child labor as an issue that needs to be addressed as fast as possible as a compliance issue, but really embedding it as part of companies' human rights due diligence activities, and listening to children. We shouldn't think that children, because they're children, are not important stakeholders. They are equally important, have different impacts than adults, and need to be involved in the process with the involvement of an expert, because we sometimes may think that we work with human rights, so we can also deal with children's rights the same way, but we cannot and have to adapt our approaches. And I wanted to just mention that today the Danish Institute for Human Rights, together with Danish Textile and Fashion, the Industry Association, has published guidance on human rights due diligence in the garment sector. And I'll put the link to the report in the chat, which can hopefully be useful guidance for garment companies in other contexts as well. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Julika. Ines.
Hard to follow as my message was so close. But I do think after all those discussions, and thanks everyone for this contribution, really, I don't think there is a contradiction or a conflict between compliance and tackling it with a child rights issue. So I think it's, I know for companies, it's very important to be compliant, and particularly child labor, as I think Tulika mentioned, it's a scary issue, and companies want to make sure that that's not something that pops up. But I think by addressing it with this child rights perspective, we're putting the children first, and we are actually creating the better solutions. And the difference between that, just to elaborate a little bit on that. So if I look at child labor from a solely compliance issue, I find a factory or a subcontractor, I see child labor, I'm basically saying, okay, I'm cutting you off, we can't longer have business, and that's my remediation. Right, like I'm done. We no longer work. Maybe I even, like some companies, go and burn the goods that have been produced with child labor, and then we are done. If we're putting child rights at the center, we're really trying to understand what is the situation of those children. How old are they? How many are they? How can we support them in this, in whatever our reaction is, to ensure we're not making things worse, and maybe just cutting off a factory, for example, or a subcontractor can make things worse. But really understanding, are there children that are in legal working age that we can support to continue working legally, but under the right and decent working conditions? And are there children who should not be working and who have to go back into school, and we should support them there? And by really asking those questions, I think we create the much better solutions that are better for the children, but at the end of the time, they also better for the business, because they create much more sustainable, long-lasting ways of tackling this. Business won't be able to solve child labor by themselves. It's an issue that goes far beyond the business, but I do think it has a very important role and can be a very, very important stakeholder and change maker, of sometimes even faster than governments. And therefore, I would encourage all of them to really put this child rights perspective at the front of the way they're tackling this difficult issue.
Great, thank you, Ines. Claire.
Yeah, I mean, it really builds upon what Tulika and Ines said, and I think, linked to what Ines was saying about the really understanding the local context. Again, we need garment industries themselves and anyone in supporting that, they need to find platforms to really listen to what young people themselves have to say, as well as their caregivers. They kind of know there are very relevant solutions that are needed to improve their lives, to give them access to quality education. Again, as Ines says, to give them the kind of decent working conditions for those that are legally able to work, but look at the kind of remediation or what support underage children need to, again, be in a better situation. I think not hide. There's always that link to compliance, the issue that people want to hide it away and not look at it or pretend it's not happening. And that can just really lead to worse situations for children and young people. But so can, as Ines said, the quick reaction of just putting children out. We know from previous research in Bangladesh and other locations that if factories that just stop without proper process, actually children can end up in prostitution, in much more exploitative and harmful forms of work. So I think it's really, really crucial not to just try get a quick fix and pass the buck somewhere else, because children will be worse. And we've talked about the child rights framework. We have to look at children's rights holistically, of the rights to survival, particularly with this COVID pandemic, that's really making it really crucial for families to survive and see it together, the survival, the protection, the participation, the development, and what children and family solutions are for that. And again, not just to have one-off consultations, but to really look at how we can have platforms for ongoing collaboration with children, young workers, families in each context, linked to businesses, but also linked to government officials who've again got the responsibility and the duty to really prevent and better protect children and support them and their families. And again, keep the gender perspective, because again, there's a number of issues here that need to be better understood of the particularities of how women, girls, mothers are differently affected than boys and men. And again, we hear from our workers with disabilities, again, don't forget the young children with disabilities, because again, they face particular barriers and again, need to extra support, access inclusive and relevant quality education.
Great, thank you, Claire. Claudia, last word to you.
Thank you. I think we all agree that this is a complex issue, and really looking at it from a holistic perspective, it's something that we totally agree, and we encourage really participation and collaboration from different stakeholders, government, unions, civil society or organizations. And if we want to make a huge or a bigger impact, also looking at transparency and traceability and getting deeper into the supply chain, I think we can do great advance in that area. And we as Gildan, we are happy to share that experience working with tier 2, tier 3 factories, and I think it's important that we continue joining efforts to address and connecting with other sectors that have also look at it and have a wealth of experience. So thanks, and it's obviously something that it requires a lot of attention and the involvement of different stakeholders.
Great, thank you so much. It's now time to turn it over to the participants. The Q&A, as I said, is on the bottom left-hand side of your screen. And if there's anybody who'd like in the audience like to submit a question, please do. And while I'm waiting for those to come in, I do have a few questions that we've collected for the panelists that I'd like to throw out there. And these questions, we've touched on it a little bit, but I just hoping that in this Q&A we can go a little bit deeper. And the one, Claudia, you had mentioned it, and others had mentioned it, but just the fact that there's these tier 1s, tier 2s, these different stages of the garment sector. So I'm wondering, how are the challenges in ensuring transparency and promoting child rights different? How are they different in raw material production and in opposed to manufacturing and distribution? Who would like to start with that? We can people can jump in.
I can start with that, and hopefully you guys will jump in. But obviously, the deeper we go, for one, the further away is the business relationship often to the consumer brand or the retailer that are the ones driving many of the ESG efforts in the supply chain. And the deeper we go, so if we are in raw material settings, we're dealing often with very different units. We're dealing with kind of the intersection between the formal and informal sector. So if we are sourcing raw materials from farmers, suddenly your unit is not a factory of 2,000 workers, but your unit is a family with 5 or 6 workers. And so it does obviously become much more and more complex. The lower we go, and often I think what we feel so much is that we don't have the walls around our production units anymore. And if we're going down the lower tiers, we're losing those walls, and it seems to become so much more difficult to tackle that. So there is definitely an increased level of challenge that we find there. But I think over again, in particular, multi-stakeholder initiatives have shown that we can impact also those raw material areas if we particularly join hands, if an industry comes together. And obviously the textile industry has been long working around cotton, and we can see that there are things really moving. I think there's a lot of new raw materials that need the same attention that cotton has received. The whole recycling industry, I think, will be a really important focus that we all should have in the next couple of years to understand where is the recycled plastic or whatever material it is coming from, because that's a whole new kind of lower supply chain that we're finding there, but also other alternative materials that the garment industry is using. I think fiber is becoming more important, and to understand what are the origins of those, where are they produced, and what are the needs of these workers. And I think COVID has shown so clearly how important it is we know those things. So while it's more complicated, while it seems further away, I think that people are the same, and if they're impacted, and we've seen it in COVID where suddenly supply chains fell apart, and we got calls from natural fiber producers saying, the factory that we produced for has closed because the stores in Europe are closed, and now we have no more income. We've worked for this factory for the last 25 years. We made an average of $5 a day through that work. Now our income has dropped to under $1. And most of this was just the one community that luckily we've worked with before, but most of those communities, you don't have somebody to call and tell them that. So if the business is not aware of the supply chains and is not aware of how those things link together, anytime we have those risks and interruptions, whether that's conflict, whether that's a pandemic, we won't have more, but whatever the issue is, a natural disaster, then these things just kind of fall together, and people are losing their livelihoods and are literally starving. So, I mean, I'm making this example just to remind us on how important it is we understand the different tiers, and how important it is we have a good sense of where our things are coming from, even if it takes some effort, even if it does seem a bit scary to start with. I think there are solutions out there, and we just need to kind of dare to go into it.
Great. Anyone else like to add to that? Very, very good, Ines.
Maybe just not to agree to the tier bit, but I think it's interesting what it is we're saying about the focus in need to increasingly focus on recycled, because we also know in a lot of countries it is children who are the majority of waste collectors who are gathering anything that's got any resale value. So I think again that opens up another bigger group of children who really need to be better understood and supported, to the opportunity to really support them. Often waste collection work again really exposes them to health risks and health issues, and the out and about kind of. So I think, yeah, it gets more and more complex. The more responsible you're ready to be, the kind of more complex it gets. But I think it's just really crucial again to that point, and to again collaborate with children to better understand their situation and their own solutions to support responsible business.
Great. Anyone else who would like to add to this question?
I think that there is a good momentum to connect those initiatives. Now that Ines was mentioning ESG is on the spectrum, and looking at environmental recycling topics, and how children might get involved in that processes. So connecting with those industries, agriculture, I think the garment industry can benefit as well, and have more impactful efforts in addressing or focusing on children's rights.
Great. Thank you. I'm noticing the time, and I can see that we're coming to our end. A couple of our panelists have a hard stop at 1:15, so I'd just like to take this opportunity to wrap up. I want to thank the OECD for providing us with a space to host this important discussion, and of course to all of our panelists, Ines, Tulika, Claire, and Claudia, for all of your thoughtful reflections and remarks. And lastly, thanks to all our participants who've tuned into this webinar from across the world. I think we've had an opportunity today to look at what the risks are. I heard education come up a lot, and I think that's both a problem, and it's a way to address some of these issues. I think listening to children and understanding the situation from their perspective, and not just bailing because you've found child labor in your supply chain, but trying to look at what is really going on and what might really help. So taking the time, slowing down, and taking the time to address child rights in a unique way, a way that's different from how you would treat other human rights, because they have unique needs and situations. So anyway, I just want to thank everybody for joining us, and we look forward to further discussions on this very, very important issue. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.